Hey everybody, welcome back to Sweet Jesus. Hope you've got your favorite dessert. I've got ice cream. It's boring again. I'm back to the old favorite, chocolate mousse tracks, but thought about running out and getting something special. Just didn't have time for it today, and so here I am with chocolate mousse tracks again. Hopefully you have got your favorite dessert of choice, perhaps ice cream, perhaps a different flavor. And I hope you have got an opportunity now to enjoy some of this sweetness with me. This is, again, Sweet Jesus, because ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. I'm not saying something because this is really sweet. So, if you're used to watching this live, doing this a little bit earlier than usual, about an hour earlier than usual, just trying to slide things up in the schedule, see if I can help out putting the kids to bed and everything more so than I usually do on a night when I'm doing this. But maybe not, because we have got a ton of stuff to talk about. Probably not going to get through all of it tonight. Hope to tackle a bunch. One thing I wanted to talk about, I got some comments about the last video, and one in particular I thought was actually important to bring up, because the last chapter talked about how whether we can take the Bible literally or not. And I guess the comment was sort of like, well, but are we supposed to take all of the Bible literally? And that's actually a very good point, because the Bible has a variety of different types of literature within it. And there are absolutely parts of it that we should for sure not take literally. But I think the case that we were dealing with last time in that chapter, Tim Keller was actually trying to make the case for the Gospels and the Gospels alone. And the Gospels are, I believe, for the most part, aside from there are some things in there that Jesus is saying that are parabolic and not actual stories. They're parables. They're things that he invented just to teach something. So obviously we don't necessarily take all of those things literally, but I think what the chapter was trying to get at was dealing with this perception that everything in the Bible is made up. And he was trying to make the case that no, it isn't. Jesus actually came, and though maybe he's telling a parable that's not literally true, he did literally say that. He existed, he lived, he died, he rose again. And that was kind of the heart of what they were dealing with that literalism idea. Again, not everything in the Bible is meant to be taken literally. Some of it's poetry, some of it's figurative, some of it's parables, all kinds of things. We're not going to solve all of that right now. Needless to say, I think Dr. Keller did do a decent job of helping us get to a point where we can say, you know what? There is a good amount of evidence, or the word we'll hear today, clues, that kind of help us to feel comfortable saying, you know what, this more likely happened than didn't. So that's kind of my take on it. Thank you for your feedback. Always appreciate your feedback. If you have feedback, pastor.grederson@gmail.com. That's pastor.grederson@gmail.com. All right, so moving along tonight, the next section of the book, this is kind of a dense, really, I don't know, up in the nosebleeds, very high level kind of thinking. There's a section here that we might spend more time than I anticipated on, a short section between the two halves of the book. The first half is kind of dealing with the challenges of the objections that come up from people that aren't believers in God, that aren't Christians. And then the second half here, what he's going to explain in the intermission is sort of the reasons for faith, why it actually makes sense, sort of the clues for faith. And he does that here in his intermission, and that's starting on page 119. And he says, so far I've examined the beliefs beneath the 7 biggest objections or doubts people in our culture have about the Christian faith. I respect much of the reasoning behind them, but in the end, I don't believe any of them make the truth of Christianity impossible or even improbable. And we have another journey to take. He says, it's one thing to argue that there are no sufficient reasons for disbelieving Christianity. It's another to argue that there are sufficient reasons for believing it. That is what I'll try to do in the last part of this volume. That's what he says kind of in the opening paragraph here. Then he gets into sort of a debate on how you prove things, how you can make an argument for something. And he talks about these two ideas that he's going to use to support his case for Christianity. Now, the first thing he lays out before he even gets there is to just say which Christianity. He talks about just a wide variety, diverse opinions. Lots of people that say, I'm a Christian, lots of beliefs out there. Hey, I'm a Christian, and here's what I believe. And wow, I'm a Christian over here, and I believe some different things. He tries to kind of lay out what it is exactly that he's going after. And essentially, he brings it down to the ecumenical creeds. So the statements of faith that the church, the body of Christ, the people that followed Jesus long ago gathered together and said, here's basically, this is, if we distill the basics down, here's essentially what it means to be a Christian. And then after that, there's a lot of things that we disagree on, and all kinds of theological arguments that separate people. And certainly, if you walk into one church, you get a very different taste of Christianity. They do things differently, and they say things a little bit differently. But in the end, what he's trying to say is the one thing that unites almost all of them, all of us, all Christians, are these creeds: the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed are the three main ones. He talks about the Chalcedonian Creed also, but basically getting at the same thing. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, and was buried. That's the Apostles' Creed, most of it at least. And so he's going to stick with that. He's not going to try and prove he's a Presbyterian. He's not going to try and prove Presbyterianism. He's not going to try and prove Lutheranism. I'm a Lutheran pastor. He's not going to try and prove Catholicism. He's going to say, here are the basics: God the Father Almighty, Jesus Christ, who came, who lived, who died, who rose again, the Holy Spirit, the Christian church, all that kind of stuff. So, how do you prove this? This is the difficulty that I think most of us are going to struggle with, us non super duper genius people, very astute philosophically, but he lays out these two different ways of kind of making a case for something. And one is strong rationalism, and then critical rationality. And strong rationalism is kind of what you hear most from the key people that are out there, not really very kind toward faith, kind toward religion, adamant atheists, where they're making this case that you can't prove in an airtight argument empirically that God exists, and so therefore I have to reject your hypothesis, your beliefs, your faith, your statements, your whatever, right? It says on pages 122, prominent disbelievers in Christianity today, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, insist that insufficient reasons do not exist, insist that sufficient reasons, do not exist for the existence of God. And Dawkins, for example, says that the claim of God's existence is a scientific hypothesis, that should be open to rational demonstration. This is like the scientific method. You can run an experiment and prove whether your hypothesis is true or not. He and his co-skeptics want a logical or empirical argument for God that is airtight and therefore convinces almost everyone. They won't believe in God until they get it. Now, is there anything wrong with this? This is Tim Keller's question, and he says, yes, I think so. They're using strong rationalism, and its proponents lay down what was called the verification principle, namely that no one should believe a proposition unless it can be proved rationally by logic or empirically by sense experience. Of course, what is meant by the word proved? Proof in this view is an argument so strong that no person whose logical faculties are operating properly would have any reason for disbelieving it. The difficulty here, and he actually does say, even Christians act like we do have some of these arguments, and that if you don't believe it, you're crazy and you're foolish, which, shame on us, because that's not accurate either. That's not helpful. He says, despite all the books calling Christians to provide proofs for their beliefs, you won't see philosophers doing so. Right? So here's the problem with all this. Not even the most atheistic. The great majority think that strong rationalism itself, right, this idea that this is how you prove things, is nearly impossible to defend as a method of determining truth. To begin with, it can't live up to its own standards. How could you empirically prove that no one should believe something without empirical proof? Again, this is where we're like getting kind of up in the clouds here a little bit. What exactly are we talking about here? You can't prove something empirically. You can't empirically prove that no one should believe something without empirical proof. And so that reveals that idea, just strong rationalism itself, is a belief. Strong rationalism assumes that it is possible to achieve the view from nowhere, so this idea of complete objectivity. But virtually all philosophers today agree that is impossible. We come to every single idea, every single judgment that we make, we all have a number of biases that lead us toward one decision or another, one idea over another. And even we come across here Thomas Nagel, an atheist philosopher who is quoted here, where he even as an atheist confesses that he has a fear of religion himself. And that fear of religion causes him to want atheism to be true. It causes him to want all the arguments for God to be disproven. And basically, so this leads us to this conclusion that there are some powerful motives for seeing the arguments in this particular debate go one way or another. He says, I am talking of the fear of religion itself. I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear myself. I want atheism to be true. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. I am curious whether there is anyone who is genuinely indifferent as to whether there is a God. Anyone who, whatever his actual belief about the matter, doesn't particularly want either one of the answers to be correct. And so if you're sort of a skeptic, a seeker type person, you're out there, you're listening, I think it's helpful to be honest about that as a possibility. But I think it's also good for us as Christians to be honest with ourselves too, that, hey, you know what, there's a lot that has led us to where we are, to kind of bias us maybe towards one way or another. It doesn't make it wrong, the conclusion that we've come to. It just means let's be honest about that, like this philosopher is, right? And one of the things that comes out later is that because he at least recognizes that, this guy Nagel has a much kinder approach toward people of faith. And I think that's ultimately what we want. We just looking at the world today, we've got so many people that are just nasty, with people of different beliefs, whether they're religious beliefs, political beliefs, any kind of beliefs. It's not so much what we believe, it's how we treat people that believe differently from us that's kind of important, especially as Christians, if we're trying to be winsome and reach people with what we believe to be the truth, the good news of Jesus Christ. We've not always done the best job of treating other people with the kind of respect that maybe we should. And maybe now the tables are turned a little bit, but let's not get into a fight over it. Let's acknowledge that we could all come to different conclusions here. And there is some reasonable conclusions to come to on one side or the other. Nagel is saying that when it comes to God, we are all like the judge. Okay, so here's an idea. Imagine a judge who comes to a case in which one of the parties involved is a company that the judge has a heavy financial interest in. The judge has to recuse themselves from the case so that they're not biased, right? Nagel is saying that when it comes to God, we are all like the judge, depending on our experiences with religion, on our other beliefs and commitments, and on how we are living our lives. We all are deeply interested in seeing the case for God go one way or the other. The trouble is, unlike that judge, we cannot recuse ourselves from this discussion because he rejects strong rationalism. Nagel has, despite his skepticism, wonderful respect toward belief in religion. I mentioned that earlier, that was coming. More often than not, when I encounter people that reject faith, that reject Jesus, Christianity, they have some really good reasons to be biased against us. But if you're out there and you are seeking, you're asking these questions, you're interested in, coming to some sort of conclusion on this pretty important issue, the existence of God, Christianity, Jesus, all that, it could be immensely important to say, to be honest with yourself about, well, I've had this really, really bad experience, and here are these people that I know that are Christians, and man, I hate their guts. They're awful. I've been in a church. I've been hurt by a church, by people in the church. Things have happened in my life that have led me to believe certain things. Identify them, and then once you've identified them, keep them kind of, maybe not in the back of your mind, but keep them in mind for sure as you go through and you're asking questions, because I would hate to make a decision based off of a bad experience and recognize that that bad experience kept me from wanting to see the truth. I know there's a strong pull. There's a strong pull on both sides. Again, let's be fair. But let's be honest about those strong pulls, and then come to some kind of a, a place of more objectivity, not perfect objectivity, but a place where we're at least closer to what we're looking for as we analyze these things. The philosophical indefensibility of strong rationalism, again, this idea of evaluating things, ideas, and philosophies, is the reason that the books by Dawkins and Dennett have been getting such surprisingly rough treatment in scholarly journals. So basically, this idea of strong rationalism is so unhelpful and such a poor way of evaluating ideas that even philosophers that might agree with people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, even with people that might agree, have come out and basically eviscerated their arguments as they have reviewed them in scholarly journals. And here's one in particular, a review of the God Delusion in the London Review of Books by a guy named the Marxist scholar Terry Eagleton. Eagleton attacks both of Dawkins' naive ideas, namely that faith has no rational component and that reason isn't based to a great degree on faith. So here we go. Here's the quote, page 124. Dawkins considers that all faith is blind faith, and that Christian and Muslim children are brought up to believe unquestioningly. Not even the dim-witted clerics who knocked me about at grammar school thought that. For mainstream Christianity, reason, argument, and honest doubt have always played an integral role in belief. Reason, to be sure, doesn't go all the way down for believers, but it doesn't for most sensitive, civilized, non-religious types either. Even Richard Dawkins lives more by faith than by reason. We hold many beliefs that have no unimpeachably rational justification, but are nonetheless reasonable to entertain. So here again, here's the idea that you can't go around proving everything beyond a shadow of a doubt. We all operate to a certain degree on faith, and just because we do operate in many areas in our lives to at least a small degree, and in some cases a larger degree, on faith, doesn't mean that what we believe is unreasonable. Okay. I hope that makes sense. This has been really tough for me even to try and come to grips with all this philosophical reasoning, philosophical language, philosophizing. But I think we intuitively understand this as, whether you're on one side or the other, as these arguments are going back and forth. I mean, it's just absurd to expect what we want to expect from either side in this particular argument. All right, so if we reject that idea, that method for evaluating ideas and truth, if we reject strong rationalism, are we then stuck in relativism? Well, that's basically without any way to judge one set of beliefs from another. And he says, of course, no. He talks about how he brought this up in chapters 2 and 3, where he argued that complete relativism is impossible to maintain. I think there was a C.S. Lewis quote, like the point of seeing through something is to see something behind it. And he talks about a glass, window, right? Glass in a window. And that the point of seeing through the window is to see the garden behind it. And then ultimately, if we see through everything, it's the same as not seeing. It's being blind. To see through everything is not to see. So no, we don't want relativism. He instead advocates an approach called critical rationality. And this approach assumes that there are some arguments that many or even most rational people will find convincing, even though there is no argument that will be persuasive to everyone regardless of viewpoint. It assumes that some systems of belief are more reasonable than others, but that all arguments are rationally avoidable in the end. That is, you can always find a reason to escape it that is not sheer bias or stubbornness. Nevertheless, this doesn't mean that we can't evaluate beliefs, only that we should not expect conclusive proof, and to demand it is unfair. Not even scientists proceed this way. Pretty powerful, right? So essentially, the way that most people come to a consensus, the way that we typically evaluate ideas, even in the realms of science, is not to prove something beyond a shadow of a doubt perfectly, completely, that no person could ever find a way out of. No, actually, there are often reasonable, unbiased reasons to say, you know what, I don't buy it. And we have to acknowledge that. We just have to. And so that's essentially what we're going to wind up with here, no matter what we do, trying to talk about God, trying to talk about Christianity, is that we will find lots of good reasons so that, if you meet someone who's a Christian and you're not a Christian, you don't need to say, man, this person's an idiot. They have checked their brain at the door. Reason has left the building. Is faith, is ignorance. That is not the case. Although, depending on who you're talking to, sometimes it feels like that's the case more often than not. I don't doubt that. There are people that, there is for them more of a, quote, blind faith. But critical rationality says that essentially there are really good cases to be made that help us recognize that there are people that believe certain things about the world, about life, and they're not crazy for believing it, but that doesn't mean that it's proven. And it doesn't mean that if you don't believe it, you're an idiot either, that you have checked your brain at the door, that you're acting in blind faith, right? So this is a much more nuanced approach, and hopefully helps us get to a spot where there's more respect for people on both sides of the issue, so that we can at least get along. Maybe you saw, Ellen DeGeneres caught a lot of flack for sitting with George W. Bush at a Cowboys and Packers game, and she had to kind of respond to a barrage of Twitter comments about how could she do that, and she basically said, hey, I don't have to agree with people to be friends with them. He's my friend. I have a lot of friends that differ in their opinions from me greatly, but that doesn't mean I can't be their friend. It doesn't mean I can't be nice. When I say be kind, I don't say be kind to the people that agree with me on everything. I say just be kind to everybody. Really a powerful thing. But hopefully this kind of idea, giving respect for people that decide for one reason or another to accept or reject a certain idea, that it is reasonable and rational, even if we wouldn't do that or we can't see why they would do that necessarily. All right. It talks a little bit about how scientists very reluctant to ever say a theory is proved. That's backing up his final comment there. Not even scientists proceed with this strong rationalism. There's something on the top of 126 here in a book, Is There a God?, where Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne argues powerfully that belief in God can be tested and justified, but not proven in the same way that it operates in the scientific realm. The view that there is a God, he says, leads us to expect the things we observe, that there is a universe at all, that scientific laws operate within it, that it contains human beings with consciousness and with an indelible moral sense. The theory that there is no God, he argues, does not lead us to expect any of these things. Right. So again, this back to the first half of the book, sort of the inconsistency in the worldview that operates with, that harps on some of these objections to Christianity. So We're going to get more into that in the next chapter, the first chapter in this next section coming up on the details there. But basically just, hey, there are a lot of things that support and are much more rational in helping us understand why we experience life the way we do and why the universe appears to be the way it is. No view of God can be proven, but that does not mean that we cannot sift and weigh the grounds for various religious beliefs and find that some, or even one, is the most reasonable, right? So he's just essentially gutting relativism there that, no, we can actually evaluate this, and we can do a better job than you might think. All right, so God the playwright. So he doesn't want us to think that if we reject strong rationality and we embrace critical rationality, that somehow we're going for second best. If the God of the Bible really does exist, critical rationality, he says, would be exactly the way we ought to approach the question of his being and existence. So actually, this is the ideal way. This is kind of what he's saying. Maybe you're familiar with this story about a Russian cosmonaut. When he returned from space, he reported, well, I was up there, looked around, and there wasn't a God, so we were right, there must not be a God, right? Well, C.S. Lewis had a response to that, and he said that this was like Hamlet going into so Hamlet from Shakespeare, this is like Hamlet going into the attic of his castle looking for Shakespeare. If there is a God, he wouldn't be another object in the universe that could be put in a lab and analyzed with empirical methods. He would relate to us the way a playwright relates to the characters in his play. We, the characters, might be able to know quite a lot about the playwright, but only to the degree the author chooses to put information about himself in the play. Therefore, in no case could we prove God's existence as if he were an object wholly within our universe, like oxygen and hydrogen or an island in the Pacific. That's always been pretty powerful for me, this idea of the playwright, that Hamlet doesn't get to know Shakespeare because Hamlet wants to get to know Shakespeare. He doesn't look for Shakespeare and find him himself. He can't analyze him the way we analyze all kinds of things in science. The only way is to find the clues that God has put about himself into the story, which again, if we believe in a God, if there is a God, a transcendent God, how could we believe that he is that small that we could get the answers we're looking for when we want them in the way we want them? I mean, just total lack of humility at all. There's another example he uses here about the sun. C.S. Lewis writes that he believes in God as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And this gets back to the thing from the quote from the previous page, where it leads us to expect the things that we observe about the universe and the world. And of course, you can't look directly at the sun, right? Burn your retinas out. Similar idea to what we were talking about. We can't just go looking for God and expect to find him exactly as we want to find him and be able to analyze him, all that kind of stuff. No, burn our retinas out. God is so wholly other than us, transcendent, all powerful, almighty, all holy and glorious and incredible, transcendent. I may have said that already. A far better way to learn about the existence, power, and quality of the sun is to look at the world it shows you, to recognize how it sustains everything you see and enables you to see it. And so here we have a way forward. We should not look into the sun, demanding irrefutable proofs for God. Instead, we should look at what the sun shows us. Which account of the world has the most explanatory power to make sense of what we see in the world and in ourselves? We have a sense that the world is not the way it ought to be. We have a sense that we are very flawed and yet very great. We have a longing for love and beauty that nothing in this world can fulfill. We have a deep need to know meaning and purpose. Which worldview best accounts for these things? And so again, Christians, we don't claim that our faith gives us omniscience or absolute knowledge of reality. Only God has that. But we believe that the Christian account of things makes the most sense of the world. And so he is encouraging readers to put on Christianity like a pair of spectacles and look at the world with it and see what power it has to explain what we know and see. And then back to the playwright idea. If the God of the Bible exists, he's not a man in the attic, but the playwright himself. And we won't be able to find him like we would a passive object with empirical investigation. We must find the clues to his reality that he has written into the universe, including into us. And that is why, if God exists, we would expect to find that he appeals to our rational faculties, right? So God has made us rational beings, and therefore we should expect not that it's proven, but that he does engage us on a rational level to look at the clues and to draw conclusions based on that. So real strong support for not blind faith, not checking your faith at the door and ignoring all rational thought, but embracing rational thought. And that by embracing rational thought, finding yourself getting actually pulled closer and closer to God. In the Christian view, he talks about how the ultimate evidence for the existence of God is Jesus Christ himself. And this idea of the playwright is really powerful in this sense, because he says he wrote himself into the play as the main character in history. When Jesus was born in a manger and rose from the dead, he is the one with whom we have to do. He is the one with which we have to wrestle, and through whom we get a lot of the clues, most of the clues. All right, clear as mud. Tricky stuff, very philosophical. The next chapter here is kind of philosophical as well. We might get more challenging stuff ahead, but I do think that there is helpful stuff here, and there are people out there that wrestle with these kinds of questions, and we need to, at least for our own faith, be able to say, well, you know what? I know you're talking way up here in all kinds of ways about all kinds of stuff, but I know that there's something wrong with that argument, even if I can't quite figure it out. And if you're on the other side and you're saying, oh man, all this stuff, yeah, there's no way, faith is crazy, Christians are crazy. No, that's not quite doing justice to it. In fact, philosophers on the other side are just as critical of some of the reasoning of people like Richard Dawkins and stuff. So, all right, so I'm going to try and do a little bit of this next chapter here, the clues of God, and take not the whole chapter, but just a few of the pieces. I think I can probably run through them fairly quickly here. A couple of quotes here at the very beginning that give a hint to where we might be going with some of these clues as they come up. This first one, if one puts aside the existence of God and the survival after life as too doubtful, one has to make up one's mind as to the use of life. If death ends all, if I have neither to hope for good nor to fear evil, I must ask myself what I am here for and how in these circumstances I must conduct myself. Now, the answer is plain, but so unpalatable that most will not face it. There is no meaning for life, and thus life has no meaning. This is from Somerset Maugham in The Summing Up. And another quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. It was true. I had always realized it. I hadn't any, quote, right to exist at all. I had appeared by chance. I existed like a stone, a plant, a microbe. I could feel nothing to myself but an inconsequential buzzing. I was thinking that here we are eating and drinking to preserve our precious existence, and that there's nothing, absolutely no reason for existing. And some of that is going to be helpful in putting some context on some of these clues we're going to come up against here. But simmer on that a little bit. If you're a skeptic, if you're secular progressive all the way on one side, right? You got to think through the implications of what you're saying. And as you think through the implications of what you're saying, man, I mean, that's these kind of quotes dripping with despair. I mean, that's ultimately where things end up. And certainly there are lots of reasons and arguments as to why, well, no, we can still have some, but ultimately they don't really deal with this ultimate end of, well, if this is true, if there is no God, there's no meaning to anything at all. Not the most cheerful of topics. So, how can we believe in Christianity if we don't even know whether God exists? Though there cannot be irrefutable proof for the existence of God, many people have found strong clues for his reality, divine fingerprints in many, many places. He talks about how he met regularly with a brilliant young scientist who was sort of haunted by the possibility, this general sense that God existed, but he couldn't quite find an argument that wasn't ultimately rationally avoidable. And so that troubled him quite a bit. He says, I can't believe unless I find at least one absolutely airtight proof of God. And then, of course, Tim Keller points out to him that he was assuming strong rationalism and got some relief when together they realized that he had no airtight proof for strong rationalism. And then he began to go back and review the lines of reasoning that he had been calling proofs and began to look at them instead as clues. So that's a helpful way of thinking through some of these things. Take away the idea of proof and look at it as clues. When we went about it with that perspective, he began to see that cumulatively the clues of God had a lot of force to them. And then there's a philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, who believes there are no proofs of God that will convince all rational persons. However, there are at least 2 to 3 dozen very good arguments for the existence of God. Most readers who take the time to think through this list will find some items compelling and others not. But however, the cumulative weight of the ones you find appealing can be formidable. And he's going to trace out a handful of them. First one, the mysterious Big Bang. And I know that there are some Christians out there that are just going to say, wow, the Big Bang itself is a bad idea. There's a lot of rejection of that in and of itself. But it does seem to be a widely accepted theory for the origins of life, the origins of the universe. And really, it kind of gives us, it actually helps Christians, whether you believe the Big Bang to be the ultimate explanation of the beginning of things or not, it does force us to ask the question, why is there something rather than nothing? The Big Bang theory really forces that on people, secular people, in a way that other theories in the past have not. The evidence that the universe is expanding explosively and outwardly from a single point, that's kind of the idea. Stephen Hawking quoted here, almost everyone now believes that the universe and itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. And then scientist Francis Collins, who is a Christian, puts this clue in layman's language in his book, The Language of God. says, we have this very solid conclusion that the universe had an origin, the Big Bang, 15 billion years ago. Again, not all Christians accept that, but 15 billion years ago, the universe began with an unimaginably bright flash of energy from an infinitesimally small point. That implies that before that there was nothing. I can't imagine how nature, in this case the universe, could have created itself. And the very fact that the universe had a beginning implies that someone was able to begin it. And it seems to me that had to be outside of nature. Science, as much as Christians and science kind of get put at odds here, there's this idea that science, in this sense, is actually helping us as Christians by saying there's this finite point. And it's actually going to lead to the next clue, where he goes into not just this finite point, but the idea that all of these things just seem to be in perfect alignment. The perfect amount of energy and mass and acceleration, all these different things that came together to make the universe what it is. So whether you like the Big Bang or not, whether you think it was 15 billion years ago or not, doesn't matter. It's forcing people outside the faith to say, how did we get here? There was a nothing, and now there's a something. Why? He talks more about this. Everything we know in this world is contingent. It has a cause outside of itself. Therefore, the universe, which is just a huge pile of such contingent entities, would itself have to be dependent on some cause outside of itself. Something had to make the Big Bang happen. But what? What could that be but something outside of nature, a supernatural, non-contingent being that exists from itself? So, something to wrestle with, for sure. A clue. The cosmic welcome mat. So here's where basically for organic life to exist, the fundamental regularities and constants of physics, the speed of light, the gravitational forces, the strength of the weak and strong nuclear forces, and more, must all have values that together fall into an extremely narrow range. The probability of this perfect calibration happening by chance is so tiny as to be statistically negligible, meaning it probably shouldn't have happened. There's a quote again from Francis Collins. He says, when you look from the perspective of a scientist at the universe, it looks as if it knew we were coming. There are 15 constants. So the gravitational constant, various constants about the strong and weak nuclear forces, etc., that have precise values. If any one of those constants was off by even 1 part in a million, or in some cases by 1 part in a million, the universe could not have actually come to the point where we see it. Matter would not have been able to coalesce. There would have been no galaxy, stars, planets, or people. And then Stephen Hawking, the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications. And elsewhere, Stephen Hawking says, it would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. This has been called the fine-tuning argument or the anthropic principle, namely that the universe was prepared for human beings. And he does spend a little bit of time talking about the fierce rebuttals that are out there, the number of rebuttals out there. Clearly there's something to this argument. That's why there are so many people coming up with rebuttals. The most common one, the one put out there by Richard Dawkins and many others, is that, well, there just must have been an enormous number of universes existing over enormous amounts of time and space, and it's inevitable that some of them are fine-tuned to sustain life, our kind of life. The one we are in is one, so here we are. Well, he actually goes on to use an example of, yeah, I guess there's a possibility that in an infinitesimal number of universes, that in this particular universe, I deal myself 4 aces in a game of poker 20 times in a row, but I'm pretty sure no one around that table is going to believe that it was an accident, right? They're going to believe that I cheated. And so really get this book. If you haven't dug into the book itself, if you haven't taken it apart and picked it apart and followed along and followed up afterward, I encourage you. There's so much more in here. I'm kind of trying to gloss over stuff, but I'm feeling like I'm skipping important things. Really get the book and take a look at it yourself. The regularity of nature. This is all the scientific laws. This is another clue, right? All scientific inductive reasoning is based on the assumption of the regularity of nature, that water will boil tomorrow under the identical conditions of today. Most people, the method, sorry, I skipped over something here. Without inductive reasoning, we couldn't learn from experience. We couldn't use language. We couldn't rely on our memories. Now, most people find that normal and untroubling, but not philosophers. David Hume and Bertrand Russell, as good secular men, were troubled by the fact that we haven't got the slightest idea of why nature regularity is happening now. And moreover, we haven't the slightest rational justification for assuming it will continue tomorrow. If someone would say, well, the future has always been like the past in the past, Hume and Russell reply that you are assuming the very thing you are trying to establish. To put it another way, science cannot prove the continued regularity of nature. It can only take it on faith. So everything you assume about the universe to do science is actually faith, kind of what the philosophers, secular philosophers, these aren't even Christians. These aren't even theistic people, theists. And actually, many scholars over the past several decades who point out that modern science only arises because of Christians who accept that there is this regularity on faith, that there is a God of the universe behind it all, who created it all and wants us to explore it. So something to think about, especially if you kind of look down on Christians for being non-science, non-rational, all that kind of stuff. Well, science comes about in large part because of Christianity, because of people that believe that there is a God and he wants us to investigate it. Next clue, the clue of beauty. This is one of the longer clues that he spends a little bit more time on. And I do think there are some objections to it that he tries to wrestle with. Again, you're never going to be able to undo all the objections. But there is something to beauty, to art, to music. What is it about those things that does something for us, that moves us in ways that other things don't? Is it just some evolutionary thing like, oh, this type of art moved my ancestors and it became somehow part of my DNA? I don't know that there's a whole lot of evidence or there's not a strong case to be made to back that up. But there's something about beauty that causes us to, it stirs something in us and helps us think about things that are bigger than us, that are larger than us, and it exposes a longing in us for something beautiful, for something that is right, that is just, it's just perfect and amazing and wonderful. And um, hits us in a way that the rest of life doesn't. That's kind of what he's getting at here in this section here, this clue, the clue of beauty. There's an art critic he quotes here who talks about a work of art that gave him a sense of obscure but inescapable meaning. In other words, while great art does not hit you over the head with a simple message, it always gives you a sense that life is not, quote, and I think he's quoting Shakespeare here, not a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. It fills you with hope and gives you the strength to carry on, though you cannot define what it is that moves you. So we don't even really know what moves us about it. Like, there are just certain times where a piece of artwork, a piece of music just gets us. It just really hits us. I think there's sort of a lot of society today, modern culture, where we don't, your average person doesn't have the kind of appreciation for art and beauty. They aren't exposed to it as much. But man, when we are, it's pretty meaningful. He has a quote here from Leonard Bernstein talking about Beethoven. He says, Beethoven turned out pieces of breathtaking rightness. Rightness, that's the word. When you get the feeling that whatever note succeeds the last is the only possible note that can rightly happen at that instant in that context, then chances are you're listening to Beethoven. Melodies, fugues, rhythms, leave that to the Tchaikovskys and Hindemiths and Ravels. Our boy has the real goods, the stuff from heaven, the power to make you feel at the finish something is right in the world. There is something that checks throughout, that follows its own law consistently, something we can trust that will never let us down. And so if there is no God and everything in this world is the product of, as Bertrand Russell famously put it, an accidental collocation of atoms, then there is no actual purpose for which we were made. We are accidents. We are the product of accidental natural forces. Then what we call beauty is nothing but a neurological hardwired response to particular data. You only find certain scenery to be beautiful because you had ancestors who knew you would find food there and they survived because of that neurological feature. Now we have it too. In the same way, though music feels significant, that significance is an illusion. Love, too, must be seen in this light. If we are the result of blind natural forces, then what we call love is simply a biochemical response inherited from ancestors who survived because this trait helped them survive. But Bernstein and Danto are testifying to the fact that even though we as secular people believe that beauty and love are just biochemical responses, in the presence of great art and beauty, we inescapably feel that there is real meaning in life. There is truth and justice that will never let us down, and love means everything. Notice that Bernstein, though by no means an orthodox religious person, can't refrain from even using the term heaven when talking about Beethoven. We may therefore be secular materialists who believe truth and justice, good and evil, are complete illusions. But in the presence of art or even great natural beauty, our hearts tell us another story. He goes on and on about this idea of beauty. Again, I encourage you to take a look at the book. But there is a sense inside us, if you've ever encountered something really powerful, really beautiful, if you've ever loved deeply, to just boil those down to biochemical responses, something happening in our brain or synapses firing a particular way because of genetics or something. Maybe there is something to that, but it points us still, it awakens in us this desire for that, that there is something right with the world, that it will be made right in the end, that love is everything, all these different things that we already talked about as I read from the book here. And if there is a need, like if we get hungry, that means there's something to put in to meet that desire, that need, right? And so the same thing, like as beauty and art and music and love, as they evoke in us, they help us to come to grips with this reality that there is a longing for that, then there must be something that fills that. And of course, this is sweet Jesus. And so what's so sweet about Jesus? Well, what's so sweet about Jesus is that Jesus, God in the flesh, in Jesus Christ, is the thing that we have all been longing for ultimately. It's that missing piece, that the missing piece we have in the present, and that longing we have for the future. That's Jesus, and so that's why I'm here. That's why I'm doing this. That's why we're talking about these things, so that not because if you have Jesus everything is perfect, but because Jesus is the best answer to all of these things and gives us something to look forward to that explains this desire, this innate desire in all human beings. So, all right, so that's the clue of beauty. Next time we'll talk about the rest of this chapter, the clue killer. The clue killer is really a clue. Those are some really deep ideas and thoughts that I didn't think I was going to be able to do justice to tonight. But I appreciate your time and interest and tuning in, and I hope you were able to enjoy some sweet stuff. And I hope you're also able to see that ice cream is sweet, but Jesus is sweeter. More next time. God be with you. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.